my channel, The Fancy Hat Lady Reads. I'm wearing one of my fancy booktube hats. I was not able to film any videos about any of my Hugo reading leading up to my departure for Worldcon, and I was only back here for a very short period of time. I am leaving town again very promptly here, and so this is the only video I'm going to be able to film for the next couple weeks, probably. But the Hugo Award reading wrap-up that I think I most want to do right now is my wrap-up of all of the nominated novellas that I read this year. So that is what this is. If you have been missing me, I am now a permanent member of the Stitch and Bitch live stream crew. We had a live stream on Sunday on my friend Rachel's channel, Kalanati. We talked a little bit about the Hugos and Worldcon, but also about a bunch of other things, and did some fun crafting. I will link that down below so that you can find it. That happens monthly on rotating channels of the members of the group. But on to the nominees in the novella category for this year's Hugos. The reason this is the category I most want to talk about is because it's the category, aside from short story, where I read the most of the nominated works. I read 5 of the 6 nominees. 3 of them I read before the nominations closed, and then 2 of them I read after the shortlist was announced. The one that I did not read was Across the Greengrass Fields by Seanan McGuire. This is, like the 5th book in the Wayward Children series at this point, and I'm not averse to continuing to read some of the books in this series. I'm just not caught up on it, so I wasn't able to get around to this one. And it was honestly a low priority for me compared to the other books and authors that were nominated here. So I'm going to go chronologically in the order that I read these, and the first one that I read was A Spindle Splintered by Alix E. Harrow. This is turning out to be the first in a series called Fractured Fables. The second book, A Mirror Mended, is already out. And this was marketed as like a Spider-Verse Sleeping Beauty retelling, and I was very excited for it. After I had a very bad DNF experience with Malice by Heather Walter, I was like, I know what I'm going to read. I'm going to read a better Sapphic Sleeping Beauty thing, and I got this out from the library, and I was kind of disappointed in this one too. I think I was just sort of expecting more creativity out of this premise. So what this is basically a portal fantasy where the means of portal is resonance between stories in different universes. So our protagonist, Zinnia, is a Sleeping Beauty type character in our universe, in our world, and she has always related to this story, always felt like it was personally relevant to her life, the story of Sleeping Beauty, because she was born with a rare disease, and she is not expected to live past a certain age. I forget exactly what age it is. And so from a very young age, she was drawn to the story of Sleeping Beauty, and, you know, the opening of the book I found really engaging because you get her narrating the story of her life through her relationship with this fairy tale that she has learned more and more about as she has gotten older and gotten a folklore degree and all of that. And then on her birthday, she touches a spindle as a joke and finds herself face to face with another Sleeping Beauty girl in a much more traditional version of this story in a much more classic fairy tale world. And so she sets out trying to save this other girl from the fate of her fairy tale, and along the way she is hoping that she will find a cure for her own quote-unquote curse. And there was just not all that much more to it than that, and I sort of thought I would be getting more, and I was trying to think of where that expectation from me came from, and I think it was the sort of Spider-Verse comparison in the marketing. The thing that really struck me about that movie was the different characters that come from their different worlds that are all animated in different visual styles and are sort of playing by different rules of storytelling. And while we do get several more Sleeping Beauties showing up by the end of this novella, mostly they're just cameo appearances and nothing about their presence, like, it doesn't bleed over into the writing style, the narrative style. I was expecting something that was more structurally interesting on a narrative level, and this was not that. There is a bit of a queer romance in here. It's between two side characters, not the protagonist. I think she might get a romance in book 2. Another thing to mention about this is that it is illustrated with basically repurposed versions of like the silhouette style illustrations by Arthur Rackham, I think, for the Sleeping Beauty fairy tale, but with like pieces rearranged. Like, there are a lot of people who are just decapitated and like their heads are somewhere else, and I just didn't understand why. Like, I sort of get it in concept, but in the process of reading the book, I didn't feel like those illustrations actually complemented the story any, so it was weird to me. Anyways, I gave this one 3 stars. I did not end up nominating it when it came time to fill out that nominating ballot. The next 2 that I read were things that I liked enough to put on my nomination ballot, though. The first is A Psalm for the Wild Built by Becky Chambers. This won the award this year, and I see why. Every year, I think I take a slightly different mental approach when I'm approaching my Hugo voting as to what sort of are the qualifications that I'm taking into consideration for deciding what I think is award worthy. And one of the things that struck me reading this year's books, both in this category and in some of the others, is that some of the nominated works this year really, to me, did feel like they spoke to something about the times, about the past year or two, both in the genre and in the world. And so I was thinking when I was voting this year about which books do you look at them and say, yes, this says something about the genre in 2021. And I think this book did, as did one of the other books in this category that I'll talk about much later. So I think in that respect, this was a worthy winner. Compared to The Galaxy and the Ground Within, which was the Becky Chambers novel from the Wayfarer series that was nominated in Best Novel, I think The Galaxy and the Ground Within spoke to me personally, and like the things that I felt like I had been going through when I read it a little more than this did for me when I read it. But that is purely subjective, and I definitely know that there are readers who felt like this was the book that they needed so much when they read it, that spoke so deeply to them. So this is the first book in a duology set in a new science fiction world from Becky Chambers. What we know about the setting is that this takes place on a moon called Panga, where the humans who live there have gone through an industrial age of some sort that led to the rise of robots and artificial intelligence, but that at a certain point the robots left society. And since then, no humans have seen the robots. They've been off living in the woods, and there's been no contact, and human society has completely reinvented itself in the wake of this exodus and is now sort of utopian-ish. Definitely a future in which people have the things they need and are able to pursue their passions And there's like a lot of coziness in this world building. There's no, at least in this first book, I haven't yet read the sequel, and I know it's out and I know people have read it, so there might be things that are revealed in the sequel, and if there are, like, I don't know if I should ask you to spoil me or not. But in this book, there is no indication that the human civilization in this is or has ever been spacefaring. So I know the temptation is to assume that this is like humanity sometime in our distant future on a different planet or moon in this case, but I found it equally plausible, if not more plausible, that this is like an alternate universe where humanity has evolved on Panga, as opposed to having evolved on Earth. That is pretty much completely beside the point, though. The point being that our protagonist is sibling Dex, who is a tea monk. They have left the city that they were living and working in to become a tea monk. That's the story arc at pretty much the beginning of the book, is sibling Dex feeling like they have to get out of the city and get away from everything that they've known before and try something different, and having maybe a bit of a rough time learning this new trade, but figuring it out in the end and becoming very good at it. In this world, a tea monk is someone who will serve tea and help people through that tea service to relieve their emotional burdens. But it turns out that getting out of the city is not enough, and despite superficially having everything they could possibly want in life, sibling Dex is basically experiencing burnout. And so they leave for the woods, off the beaten path, and in the woods they meet the robot Mosscap, who is setting out to reestablish contact with the humans. And this is basically a very character-driven story about their relationship and what they learn from each other. This book is a lot about whether or not you really have to have a purpose for your life to be meaningful, or whether it is enough to just be. I gave this 4 stars. I put it on my nominating ballot. I was hoping it would win in this category, and it did. The other book that I read and enjoyed in time to nominate it in this category was Fireheart Tiger by Aliette de Bodard. This is a book that is a standalone. It's not a part of any of Aliette de Bodard's previous fictional universes, and it uses the backdrop of a political court fantasy story to interrogate the power dynamics in a romantic relationship. This is about a princess named Tan, that's spelled Thanh, and I looked up the pronunciation on that, but I'm not sure I got it quite right. She is a princess of a matriarchal Vietnamese-inspired fantasy kingdom. Her mother is the empress, but she is not one of the most favored daughters. She has a lot of insecurities, and she feels like her mother judges her for not being bold and confident. When she was younger, she was sent away in basically one of these you're a guest but actually you're a hostage political situations to a more European-coded fantasy kingdom, where she experienced both the trauma of a palace fire that still haunts her, and experienced a first romantic relationship with that country's princess. But she is back now, and because the country that she was sent to is in political negotiations with her mother, she is expected to step forward as part of these negotiations with the visiting guests. And of course, one of the visiting guests turns out to be her former lover, the princess. I'm not sure I liked this quite as much as the novellas of Aliette de Bodards that I've read that are in her science fiction Shuya universe. I probably like this better than The Citadel of Weeping Pearls, but a little less than both Tea Master and the Detective and Seven of Infinities. This might be on par with On a Red Station Drifting for me, which was 4 stars, but maybe a slightly lower 4 stars than the others. I want to say that I'm not sure the marketing on the back of the book is doing this novella any favors. It says that it's The Goblin Emperor meets Howl's Moving Castle, and I do not get either of those comps for this book. I would not have used either of those books as comp titles for this. So if you picked it up because of those comp titles, you're probably going to be disappointed. That said, I personally still appreciated this book. I gave it 4 stars, a slightly lower 4 stars, I think, than some of the other 4-star books in this category. If we're talking about what is the book of the year that says something about the genre in 2021, I'm not sure I could really make an argument for this one, even though it does have some interesting things to say about power dynamics in relationships. And then I read 2 more of the nominated novellas from the Hugo voter packet on ebook. The first was Elder Race by Adrian Tchaikovsky, which I sort of had no idea what to expect from this because I had never read anything by Adrian Tchaikovsky before. And I now see why he's so popular. This was really readable, really fun, really engaging. This is another one, though, where I'm like, is this the book that speaks to this year in genre? No, but I enjoyed the heck out of it. This is a dual perspective story from the points of view of 2 different characters from one of the POVs. It is basically a science fiction story, and from the other POV, it's basically like a sword and sorcery fantasy story, because this is one of those regressed society sci-fi planets where it was colonized by humans, and then society became something that looks more like a fantasy world. And what do you know? The things that people think are magic are actually advanced science that they do not understand. So the premise is one of these like staples of the SFF genre that I feel like has been around for ages. It's nothing new or revolutionary. However, I really did enjoy the story. It was a super quick, super engaging read, and I really loved the characters. So our fantasy protagonist is Liness. She is a princess, and her land is being threatened by something that her people call a demon. So despite not having permission to do so, she takes a great risk to go and call upon an age-old pact with the sorcerer who lives in the tower near her kingdom, city, palace, wherever, who is actually an anthropologist named Nir, the sci-fi character who has basically like been asleep in stasis for a very long time. He is supposed to like occasionally wake up and make observations on the progress of the planet and its people, but he is not supposed to interfere. However, he is starting to come to the conclusion that his people have abandoned him here and are never coming back for him. And so when Liness shows up to wake him from his slumber and drag him on a quest to hunt a demon, he starts to question the principle that he is not supposed to get personally involved with the people on this planet. There are some fun touches, like he has all of these like body augments and stuff that are obviously like surgical augments that are very high tech, but that make him look like a sort of non-human monster type person to Liness. He's also got like a burgeoning emotional crisis about having been abandoned on this distant planet that he is managing by using a system that like overrides his emotions so he doesn't have to feel them. And Liness is like this archetype of the misfit princess who becomes a plucky heroine that is the sort of protagonist character type that I was weaned on as a young fantasy reader, so I immediately latched on to her pretty strongly. And they go on a quest together to solve a mystery and face a thing that may or may not be a demon. One of the major themes this is playing with is how sort of language and translation errors lead to miscommunication between them, or maybe not. He feels initially like he doesn't really have the language to explain to her the truth of what's going on. On the other hand, I think it becomes clearer and clearer as the book progresses that he has been severely underestimating the extent to which Liness and her people actually have a very sophisticated understanding of how they came to this planet and what the things that they call magic really are. This was fun, it was engaging, I really enjoyed it. I gave it 4 stars. I will definitely seek out more books by Adrian Tchaikovsky in the future. Was this the novella of the year in any way? I would also argue no. And finally, the last novella that I read from this shortlist is the other book that I would have been happy to see win this award, and that is The Past is Red by Catherynne and Valente. This struck me as the most ambitious literary storytelling effort of the novellas on this shortlist that I read. It's also one that I personally had really mixed emotional reactions to. For me, I found it to be profoundly sad, even though it has a very optimistic protagonist. I think the way this sort of odd balance strikes different readers may vary. This is about a girl, later a woman, named Tetley, over a course of many years, who lives in a whimsically written but very bleak science fictional future in which the entire world is flooded, the entire earth is flooded, there's no dry land masses left, and people either live on boats or on the landmass, the floating landmass that has been constructed out of the remains of the Great Pacific Garbage Patch, and that is where this story takes place. This story takes place in Garbage Town. And it is weird. You have to be okay with it being weird. You don't go into a Valente science fiction book expecting something that's going to feel gritty and realistic and make you truly believe that this is what the future is going to feel like. Her writing always feels a smidge too fantastical for that, even when she's writing sci-fi. I personally find that very interesting. I don't mind it. In fact, I rather like it. But like, you can see some of the writing techniques that you see in some of her fantasy novels sort of repurposed in how she's designed Garbage Town. You have all of these different neighborhoods that are made out of different garbage materials, and like, you see that in a bunch of her fantasy novels, like in The Orphan's Tales and Fairyland and Glasstown Game. Like, it shows up a lot in her stuff. The other thing I think it's worth knowing about this book going in is that it is an expansion upon a previously published short story. The short story was called The Future is Blue. I think it was originally published in an anthology of climate fiction, and then it was later the title story of short story collection of Valente's. I never read that short story. I think it's basically the first quarter of this novella. And this novella is pretty clearly divided into part 1, which is that first story, and then part 2, which feels like its significantly longer sequel story. And both parts are told non-chronologically. You get time jumps within them, but part 1 all takes place before part 2, if that makes any sense. So in part 1, Tetley is, she's maybe 19, looking back on her childhood and coming of age. And what you know about her is that she's basically a social pariah because of something she did that everyone in Garbage Town hates her for and is legally allowed to punish her for. And then the sort of reveal at the end of that story is the reveal of what she did and why. I won't spoil that, but it feels like a complete and contained story. And then, so part 2, which is much longer, again, takes until closer to the end to reveal its secrets because of the non-linear storytelling. And I think if this novella has like one big structural flaw, it's that it takes significantly far into that part 2, or for me, it took significantly far into that part 2 to feel like I understood why part 2 was needed, what it was adding that made it worth reading something that was like 3 times longer, maybe 4 times longer than the original story. Was there really going to be a payoff? And I think there was, and I won't spoil that one either. What I will say is that some of this book is very dark, despite being kind of whimsically written. It ends up exploring some of the sort of nastiness that can come out of people and of society when people feel like they have been denied a better life that they were promised or entitled to. There is a sort of side plot about what sort of leaders those people want to believe in that feels very pointedly political. On the other hand, it is all about Tetley's unrelenting feeling and insistence that Garbage Town, which is literally the garbage of a wrecked, destroyed world that can never be brought back, is itself beautiful, and that life in Garbage Town is worth living and worth enjoying on its own merits. And man, this book just left me with a lot of feelings, even though I can't say I enjoyed reading it. I was really glad I had read it. I also gave this one 4 stars. So there were a lot of 4-star reads in this batch, nothing less than 3 stars, and yet there were clearly 2 books for me that rose to the top in terms of there are reasons why this feels like it is a book we can give an award to in 2022. And ultimately, one of those 2 books won. So the last thing I want to talk about has to do with the fact that everything on the shortlist for Novella this year came from one publisher, Tor.com. And Tor.com is the biggest SFF publisher that regularly publishes lots of novellas. In many ways, I think they are responsible for the current popularity of SFF novellas because of how successful they've been in marketing their novellas in recent years. However, from an awards standpoint, it is frustrating to see one publisher dominating the conversation. And so I want to put a distinct effort this year into reading some new release novellas that come from other publishers. So I mentioned I was about to leave town. I will be traveling very light. I will be traveling carry-on. And so I will be bringing with me to read on this trip only novellas published in 2022 that are not from Tor.com. So this is my stack, and I just wanted to show you what I'm bringing with me and planning on reading, in hopes that I will have novellas of more diverse publishing origin to nominate for this award come next year. First, Uncommon Charm. This is from Neon Hemlock Press. I have heard things about this book from people who've read it that make me think it will be right up my alley. Then Some by Virtue Fall by Alexandra Rowland, and also Over All the Earth by Alexandra Rowland. These are both self-published. And then last but not least, The Language of Roses by Heather Rose Jones, which is from Queen of Swords Press. And so I am hoping that I will love some of these. I can't imagine that there won't be at least one or two hits for me from this batch. But if you have read any other novellas that have come out this year in 2022 from a publisher other than Tor.com in the sci-fi and fantasy speculative fiction genre that you think I would like, please drop me a recommendation below. Anyhow, I hope you are having a good day. That is all. Bye for now.